Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk to you tonight about my book, The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan. And the book, I have to warn you in advance, goes down not easily politically for both friends who are conservative and friends who are liberal. Conservatives have a problem with the book or find it tough because the thrust of the book is that Reagan did not win the Cold War, at least in the way that it's commonly assumed he did. That is, it wasn't a matter of simply building up America's defenses and having the Soviet Union say uncle and collapse. That's not the way the story, that's not the way it actually happened. It's a tough book for liberals because it's about Reagan at all. Because the book does give Reagan considerable credit for the way he carried out his Soviet policies and particularly his diplomacy with Mikhail Gorbachev in the last 4 or 5 years of Reagan's 8-year presidency. And the question really raised by the book is Ronald Reagan the way we actually now tend to remember him? What we think we remember what actually happened? Because in fact, when you look back, and really I spent 3 years on this book going over not just interviews, but considerable time in the archives. And simply looking back through the events, what you find is a history that has now been lost to us. What we remember is the Ronald Reagan of the first 3 years, and even that's a caricature, but the Ronald Reagan who gave the speech calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, the Ronald Reagan of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan the hawk. And even that's a little simplistic, but it is accurate for the first roughly 3 years of Reagan's presidency. What's forgotten is the rest of the story, which is really from about 84, 85 on. In early 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes leader of the Soviet Union. And over the next 3 or 4 years, you have a remarkable series of events. Reagan has 4 summit meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev. At one of them, they talk about eliminating nuclear weapons. Reagan manages to get passed and approved, ratified by the Senate, the first arms control treaty that any president has gotten enacted for about 15 years. A dramatic change. It was the first time that the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to eliminate an entire class of missiles. Also forgotten, in the 4th of Reagan's 4 summits with Gorbachev, he goes to Moscow in 1988. He's standing in Red Square, and reporters ask him the obvious question, so is this still evil empire? And he says, no, that was another time, another place. We forget this history now. And what you forget even more, more politically, is that in 1988, in the 1988 campaign, believe it or not, you will find that Vice President George Bush runs to the right of, more conservative than Ronald Reagan, and begins to suggest that Reagan has become too enamored of Mikhail Gorbachev. One reason that he says that is that starting in about 1985, the conservatives begin to turn against Reagan in his Cold War in his diplomacy. Again, something we forget now, but if you picked up the op-ed pages of your newspaper anytime in 85, 6, 7, or 8, you would find conservative denunciations of Ronald Reagan. Let me give you just a fairly representative example from George Will. This is in an 87 column. 4 years ago, many people considered Reagan a keeper of the Cold War flame. Time flies. For conservatives, Ronald Reagan's foreign policy has produced much surprise, but little delight. And George Will was, who now, in fairness to him, admits that he was wrong and that Reagan was right, was throughout this period, as many other conservative columnists were, regularly criticizing Reagan for his willingness to carry out this diplomacy with Gorbachev. Now let me step back for a minute and look at what were the fights about on Cold War policy and Soviet policy during this period. What were people arguing about? You had a very specific division in Washington. Was Gorbachev for real? Gorbachev becomes the Soviet leader in early '85, and you get two schools of thought about him. Neither, no one can tell how it's going to turn out. But one side says, this is just another face for the same old Soviet policies. The Soviet Union is not really changing. The symbol of this policy, whose ideas I trace through in the book, is a familiar figure to many of you, to all of you, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, in the 1970s, pursues a policy of détente with the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan always supports Nixon through the time that he leaves office, so he says nothing about détente with the Soviet Union, but as soon as Nixon leaves office and Gerald Ford is president, Reagan, the hawk, criticizes the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, Henry Kissinger. Well, you move ahead 10 years to the 1980s, and Nixon is the hawk, and believe it or not, in funny ways, Reagan is the dove. So let's, just to take an example, Nixon goes off to Moscow to meet Gorbachev for the first time. And I'll read his words because they were very representative of really mainstream thinking in Washington about Gorbachev. In essence, he's the most affable of all the Soviet leaders I've met, but at the same time, without question, the most formidable, because his goals are the same as the previous leaders, and he will be more effective in attempting to achieve them. Now, this was a plausible thing to say in '85 or '86 when Nixon writes them. They just turned out to be not to be true. And this misperception of Gorbachev as just the same as other Soviet leaders is something that is shared by conservative leaders and many foreign policy specialists in Washington. Nixon wasn't alone. I call it sort of the metallurgy of the Cold War, because you find the same metaphors coming up again. Charles Krauthammer writes, "Mr. Gorbachev, your iron teeth are showing." And Henry Kissinger has the same misperception. Gorbachev and his associates seem less constrained by the past and more assertive with respect to Soviet power. Inside the United States government, the traditional view of Gorbachev comes from the CIA's leading expert on the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Bob Gates. That would be the current defense secretary, Robert Gates. And Gates was so persistent in arguing that the Reagan administration was moving too fast with Gorbachev that he wasn't substantially different than his predecessors. Gates argued that so much that Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, tried to get him fired. So these were the battle lines in this debate were Reagan and Shultz, who were trying to conduct this diplomacy with Gorbachev on the one hand, and conservative columnists, conservative groups. There are some conservatives who accuse Reagan of treason, and also foreign policy specialists who argue that Gorbachev is not substantially different. And in this unusual period, the people who seem on the outside from this debate but support Reagan, believe it or not, are the liberals. So if you picked up the cartoons of the time in late 1987 when Gorbachev comes to Washington and signs an arms control agreement with Reagan, there's one wonderful cartoon that shows Reagan in the Oval Office signing his arms control treaty with Gorbachev, and behind him are Michael Dukakis, Jesse Jackson, Dick Gebhardt, all the Democratic candidates for president, and the underline is Ronald Reagan flanked by the supporters of his arms control agreement. This is so the book I write tries to recapture this history as it actually went down, not the way we remember it. And some of the material in the book, because really what I like to do is simply recount a history rather than anything else, is simply to tell some of the stories of this period. So I tell in the book the story of Richard Nixon's secret meeting to the White House. Again, Nixon is behind the scenes, the hawk in this debate. Reagan, who knows Nixon very well for decades, invites him on a secret meeting to the White House. Nixon hasn't been back upstairs in his old living quarters since the day he left in 1974. And Reagan brings him in upstairs. Nixon kind of looks around. And I found for the first time people hadn't run across Nixon's own notes of this meeting. Nixon goes in and he looks around and he sees that Nancy Reagan is able to spend more money redecorating the White House than he and his wife Pat were able to. And Reagan sits him down and asks for his help, his support in his diplomacy with Gorbachev, and Nixon won't give it to him. I tell the story in the book of a woman named Suzanne Massie, who was Reagan's informal advisor on Soviet affairs. Probably one of the most unorthodox advisors on Soviet policy that's ever existed. She was not an academic, she was an author. She had co-written the book Nicholas and Alexandra. Maybe some of you have either seen the book or read the movie. It's about the last Tsar. Suzanne Massie herself had a son who was a hemophiliac. She began traveling to the Soviet Union and the record shows that Reagan invited her to the White House, talked to her close to 20 times, more than anybody except his closest advisors, because she provided for him context, immediacy to what was going on the streets in the Soviet Union. And he was kind of curious. Reagan was someone who liked to have, he didn't really like to read a dry analytical study. He loved stories. He liked anecdotes. He liked proverbs. Well, Suzanne Massie could give him things like that. So the words that many of you remember from the late 1980s, Reagan's slogan that he used over and over again, trust but verify, was something that Suzanne Massie had brought to him. And after a while, Reagan and Soviet leaders begin to circumvent their own bureaucracies by sending messages through Suzanne Massie. So some of the diplomacy for when Gorbachev would come to the United States, when Reagan would go to Moscow, was carried not through the State Department, but through this woman who had no official position at all, but was someone who Reagan liked and whose messages he trusted, whose impressions he trusted. And it got to the point where the National Security Council by about 1987, had a campaign on, keep this woman away from the Oval Office, because they thought that in some way she was influencing Reagan on Soviet policy. I don't necessarily think she was, but she's certainly one of the stories of these final 4 years. Well, in the center of all this is Reagan himself. So let me talk about what he was like, because Reagan had his own style in dealing with foreign leaders, and particularly with leaders of communist countries. Specifically, he loved to tell anti-communist jokes, and he would drive people like Gorbachev crazy. Gorbachev was a classic debater. That is, he was trained in law school. He would come into a meeting with an agenda of, 6 or 8 points, and he would treat each issue very logically. And he'd come in and he'd sit down and he'd be primed to talk about arms control, and Reagan would tell him a joke. And some of his jokes, it was vintage Reagan patter. I mean, but they had a real anti-communist point. So it was, what are the 4 things the matter with Soviet agriculture? And the leader he was dealing with would say, I don't know, well, spring, summer, fall, and winter. This is not just for communist leaders. Helmut Schmidt, the leader of the West German leader, comes in, sits down, and Schmidt is a very polished guy with his own, wanted to talk to him about missiles, and Reagan told him a joke about Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, showing his mother his expensive foreign cars, and she says, what happens if the commies come and take them away? Well, these jokes actually served a purpose, not something that Reagan ever talked about. I can't swear it was, what was in his mind or was not, but it threw people off their guard. It took them off their agenda. It deflected people from coming on too strong with their own issues, and after a while, people found themselves dealing with Reagan in his own terms. I found, for example, at the last of the 4 summits between Gorbachev and Reagan in Moscow, Gorbachev goes over to his desk and says, to prove a point, let me show you some letters I have of some Russians or some Soviets from Irkutsk. Well, this is Reagan's style. Let me show you some letters I have. This is not something Gorbachev would have done. So I actually talked to the note taker, one of the note takers at the summit in Moscow. Each of these summits is divided into 2 different kinds of meetings, one-on-one meetings, and then great big formal meetings with 15, 20 officials per side. Reagan wasn't very good at the 15 to 20, at the big meetings, but and Colin Powell actually remembers Reagan really telling jokes and falling flat in these big meetings. In the one-on-one meetings, he really kind of managed to dominate through his anecdotes, his stories. And I talked to the note taker at the Moscow summit who said that Gorbachev would make a point, would look around the room, one-on-one, there are note takers in the rooms. He would look around the room kind of looking for an audience to nod and say that he was good, and there was no one in the room but Reagan who would tell another joke. And you could see Reagan really diverting things onto the issues he wanted to talk about. So the historical issue is, how do you explain this difference between Reagan's first 3 years and then this intensive diplomacy with Gorbachev? And there's some people, there are people who say none of this diplomacy amounted to much. Well, as it turned out, by building up Gorbachev, Reagan gave Gorbachev the time he needed to proceed with his reforms in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev himself writes that he really needed the international recognition that Reagan and the United States were giving him. And by conducting this intensive diplomacy, Reagan was building up Gorbachev so that it was harder for the old guard in the Soviet Union to move against him. So the overall judgment of Reagan, I think, there are people on the left who treat Reagan as though he was just a dunce. I don't think the record bears that out. The right wing opposite of that is to think that Reagan was simply a man of simple virtues. I interviewed Nancy Reagan for the book. She doesn't fit in either of those categories, but she said, as she has said before, that Ronnie, as she said, has no guile. Well, I found, as I looked at this record, that I don't know if guile is the right word or just sheer canny instincts, but Reagan, as someone who had spent his early years as a labor negotiator, had a remarkable sense of timing, of leverage, of how to negotiate. He could be extremely passive from day to day or week to week in Washington, but then ultimately he made the decisions on his own. And some of those decisions were strange, to say the least. The arms control treaty I discussed was timed, had to be signed at, I think it was 1:23 p.m. in the afternoon, because that was the time set by Nancy Reagan's astrologist. Reagan got some things wrong. He really thought that Gorbachev was religious, and I spend a good part, a long passage in the book describing how Reagan at one point tried to convert Gorbachev, being convinced that he was secretly somehow a Christian, and there was not, and is not, decades later, any evidence of that. But he got Gorbachev right where the conservatives and the foreign policy establishment did not, that Gorbachev did recognize significant change, represent significant change for the Soviet Union. And so my own view on the end of the Cold War is that, well, part of it, the Cold War ended by any stretch of the imagination in 1989. You can either date it on the day that the Berlin Wall came down, or you can say, take a broader view and say the Cold War ended throughout the year of 1989, when there's a series of events in Poland and Hungary and then East Germany in which communist regimes eventually collapse. And the key to the end of the Cold War was Gorbachev's decision not to intervene. And we look back now after 20 years and we think this is a given, but it wasn't. And I interviewed for the book the East German leader at the time the wall came down, a guy named Egon Krenz, who, as the wall is coming down, calls Gorbachev, can't get through to Moscow, gets a call the next morning from the Soviet ambassador in East Germany saying, "What are you doing? How could you allow this to happen? We demand an explanation from you." And he sits down and writes his explanation to Moscow, and 2 hours later gets a call and a message back saying, a message delivered from Gorbachev saying, "We commend you." It wasn't automatic that the Soviet Union was simply going to allow the wall to come down. And the key was Gorbachev's decision to just let this happen. And what was in Gorbachev's mind? I would submit to you that what was in his mind was that he wanted this new relationship with the United States and Western Europe that had been built up over the previous 4 years. The Cold War didn't have to end so easily. I mean, there could have been a long stalemate. There could have been an explosion in the Soviet Union. And the way the Cold War ended was, to a great extent, the result of the diplomacy that led up to it. So let me give you the final paragraph of the book, which is the conclusions. In the end, the Cold War sputtered out without any large-scale violent upheavals or explosions. It was not inevitable that the climax should have been so anticlimactic. It was not inevitable that unquestionably, Gorbachev played the leading role in bringing the 4-decade-old conflict to a close. Yet Reagan, overcoming considerable opposition of his own at home, played a crucial role by buttressing Gorbachev's political position. It was in this sense that Ronald Reagan helped ensure the Cold War ended in the tranquil fashion that it did. Reagan didn't win the Cold War, Gorbachev abandoned it. By recognizing Gorbachev's significance when many others in the United States did not, Reagan helped create the climate in which the Cold War could end. Thanks very much, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Bill, we'll start over there.
Thank you. During the course of your talk, I began speculating that perhaps in these extensive conversations that Reagan had with Susan Massey, he began to intuit that there were a lot of weaknesses in the Soviet Union, perhaps even the head of his CIA, who were basically counting missiles and tanks and didn't see that the underlying structure was rotting away. And maybe this gave him a feeling of confidence that he could deal with Gorbachev from a position of strength, if you will. And this is something a lot of his conservative critics did not appreciate. I wonder what your thinking is on this.
Well, I think there's something, let me step back for a minute and say this didn't exactly start with Massey. And although, again, we tend to think of all conservatives as having the same point of view. In fact, even from the start of his presidency, there are differences of opinion where there's some on the right who see the Soviet Union as tremendously powerful, and there are some others, not Reagan alone, who see it as vulnerable and weak. And you go back to 1981 even, and at the time of martial law in Poland, or actually at the time, I believe, that the Pope visits Poland, and Reagan writes to a friend, I think that the Soviet Union is vulnerable. It has, and one Achilles heel could be religion. He did see it as much more vulnerable than others did. And then Suzanne Massey, going back and forth, gives him a sense, I think, that the way the Soviet Union looks on the streets is different than just the studies of the leadership. That if you look simply at the old guard in Moscow, analyze the Politburo, you get one picture because they don't change. The only difference is Gorbachev looks and is, 20 or 30 years younger than his predecessors. But on the streets, things are beginning to open up. And that's the kind of thing I'm sure the battles over the CIA continue because there are people who say the CIA really understood what was going on. The record is not so clear. I mean, their reports don't seem to show this. They seem to not perceive the changes. Again, Gates was actually then the leading person in analyzing Soviet affairs. And somehow Suzanne Massey begins to give him a sense, or to further his own sense, that things are moving and that the United States should somehow support these sort of changes on the streets.
Right here.
Mr. Mann, very simply, to the best of your knowledge in your research in writing your novel, did the U.S. act?
I have to it's not a novel, I hope. Go ahead.
If I were better educated, I'd use a better word. To the best of your knowledge, did the U.S. elicit any support from its closest allies? If you will recall, at the time, Margaret Thatcher was the head of Great Britain, how much information did we share with our closest allies? Because the common belief is that the Soviet Union fell without firing a single shot. And I think that is the strangest thing that would have ever been thought about prior to the fall of that wall.
United States, you mentioned, first of all, the British, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, who played a vital role in, she met with Gorbachev before Reagan did. It was actually a couple, 3 or 4 months before Gorbachev becomes the top leader. And she says, I think, you know, this is a man we can deal with, I think. And she becomes a strong advocate for dealing with Gorbachev. And she's, of course, very close to Reagan. And yet, you know, Margaret Thatcher is hardly some naive person or something. And you can see, apart from American diplomacy, conversations between Gorbachev and Thatcher. Some of Gorbachev's aides have written about this since. She would go into Moscow and tell Gorbachev he was out to lunch, that he didn't, you know, he wasn't moving fast enough, that she was quite stiff with him. So she both in goading Washington to deal with, and Reagan to deal with Gorbachev, and in talking to him, she was very important. Helmut Kohl in West Germany, the West German chancellor, was also very important, but he had not until later on a more difficult relationship with Gorbachev. There's a point about a year after Gorbachev becomes the Soviet leader when Kohl gives an interview to a news magazine and makes an analogy between Gorbachev and Goebbels, I think. I mean, it sort of all springs out. It's not clear he really means to say this, but you know, Gorbachev, there's a great charm offensive. It reminds me of Goebbels. And Gorbachev, to say the least, doesn't like this and won't talk to Kohl or deal with him for another couple of years. Are they exchanging information? Yes. The U.S., the Soviets, the French, I'm sorry, the U.S., the British, the French, and the West Germans are exchanging information a lot. Still, there's a point even weeks before the Berlin Wall comes down when the West German intelligence officials are telling Americans there's going to be no German reunification in my lifetime, and these are young people who are talking. So they're exchanging information, but I'm not sure that they have it all right. At the leadership level, Thatcher's impressions are important.
Right on the inside. Here it comes.
The discussion so far, you've really characterized this in terms of personalities and the diplomacy that went on. If you look at it from an economic standpoint, however, I might submit that Gorbachev was really a pragmatist, because economically, did he have a choice to carry forward?
I'm sorry, that he had a choice or had no choice? I didn't quite understand.
I really don't think that he had a practical choice. The Soviet Union was nearing economic collapse. About 1988, 1990, something like that, they actually couldn't even fund importation of food. And as you said, you know, their agriculture was a catastrophe. Would you like me to, you know?
No, I agree.
I think the economic framework is absolutely critical to the whole issue, to the fall of the empire.
Let me draw a distinction between two things. Yes, the Soviet Union its economy was imploding. It's a step to go from that to allowing the fall of the wall, to allowing these revolutions in Eastern Europe. They were broke, but they could have maintained, you can decide that we're not going to compete with the United States, missile for missile, nuclear weapon for nuclear weapon. They had more tanks. The Soviets had more tanks. you can decide we can't compete militarily and still maintain things at a low level, enough to preserve Eastern Europe. I'm not sure that they were, I agree that their economy was falling apart, but by most analyses I've seen, they could have decided to preserve the status quo in Europe. They weren't forced to do that economically.
Oh, hold on one second. So,
No, well, actually, no. Actually, oil prices probably they fell apart before that, and that was again a cause of the Soviet downturn. But again, that doesn't. You can't. I don't think you can get from there to simply giving up completely. I think you can get from there to deciding you're not going to match the United States. And you know, there is a whole school of, you know, I think on both sides of some of the debates on Soviet policy, a sense that that there could have been a long, drawn-out stalemate or attempt to preserve the status quo. That last step of deciding to allow all of Eastern Europe to go took something beyond sheer economic downturns.
now we're going to move on in the back.
First off, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your time and your discussion tonight. My question comes from kind of an original comment you made starting out tonight, suggesting that perhaps the Reagan that is remembered today was not the Reagan that really was. And to that point, I guess I throw out a prompt to you for alternative history, and that would be, could the Reagan of the 80s run in an election today and even be successful coming out of the Republican Party in a world with, you know, Rush Limbaugh's and Hannity's and Sarah Palin's, et cetera? He wasn't overtly religious. He was from Hollywood. He was divorced. I mean, all of these things, all these social issues that a candidate for today trying to claim that conservative mantle could be very problematic. And I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you think he could be Ronald Reagan today.
Well, I think that Republicans of the different Republicans are modeling themselves after a Reagan who was a caricature of the real Reagan. I think to broaden it beyond the Cold War and Soviet policy, which is the focus of this book, that the heart of Reagan, from which he did not, that he really held to, was economic conservatism. He managed to put together social conservatives, economic conservatives, and national security conservatives. And he put that coalition together in ways that have begun to fall apart. I mean, you saw in the last election and after the last election, 2008, fights beneath the surface, sometimes coming above the surface, between people who wanted to cut taxes and social conservatives. What should Republicans say? And I don't, you know, that coalition today, I'm not sure can be held together in the way that Reagan brought it together. I think that the natural tensions are such that it would be hard even for Reagan himself to hold it all together today. And every Republican now has to face a choice. So I noticed, just looking at the news in the last couple weeks, that Sarah Palin was in Hong Kong and gave a speech. And I was interested, because I'm interested in China too. What was she going to say? And the thrust of her speech was to emphasize the economic side, what would be the economic side of conservatism, tax issues for sure, and to duck all of the national security implications. She said nothing that was particularly provocative, in fact, avoided saying much that was provocative about China and the security dimensions of China, for example. Because I think the heart of the battle for the next, for the nomination in 2012 will be on economic conservatism. And in fact, you know, I mean, that's the way it is anyway, and you know, that's where Mitt Romney is going to be. I think, and Republicans are so divided on national security. I mean, you see George Will coming out in favor of withdrawing from Afghanistan, and the neoconservatives, people like Bill Kristol, being very much in support of the war. So I think Republicans are going to stay away from national security, on which they're divided. And really the battle for the nomination, this is now, you know, 3 years to a couple of years from now, is going to be on taxes and economic issues. And on that, I mean, that would be the core of Reagan, I think.
Right here.
Oh, sorry.
In the third row.
Very much appreciate you being here and your enlightened view on what happened back then. Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine asserted, I guess in the very late 80s, that the defining event that brought down the Soviet Union was sort of a Star Wars event that we didn't hide. It was public. We launched a target missile from God knows where out in the Pacific, and an interceptor missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And it was in the newspaper. The next day, you could see the intercept and the explosion of them. Well, it turns out we'd put a homing beacon in the interceptor, and the missile we launched from Vandenberg hit it, of course. It homed in on it. And part of their assertion was that Reagan was in on this because he knew that that event publicly would have such an effect on the Soviet Union and their economy that it would make them throw in the towel, so to speak. I wonder if in your research you found anything along that line that would confirm, number one, did that happen? And number two, did Reagan know of it?
Specifically, that event, no. In general, I found that the Soviets were remarkable, and Gorbachev in particular, were remarkably spooked by Reagan's Star Wars program. And there is one historical debate now, sort of looming and just being argued out. What if, well, let me back up. There's, in one of the most important of the summits in 1986 in Reykjavik, Gorbachev goes in and offers a dramatic series of reductions in missiles and nuclear weapons, and Reagan is extremely interested until it's made conditional on limits on Star Wars. And Reagan says, with seeming reservations, not sure of himself, is kind of upset afterwards, but says no. And that's for the time being, that's the end of that that line of diplomacy. And the question is, what if he'd said yes? What if they'd reached this agreement? And you know, that's one of those what ifs. I mean, it's taken the United States now, you know, it's been 23 years since Reykjavik. The U.S. is developing missile defenses, but in different ways. It's changing again in the last couple of weeks, its approach. What if they'd reached this agreement? What would have happened?
Right here. You still have a question? Oh, you got it? All right. Here you go, Brandon.
Mr. Mann, I'd like to go back to the personalities of the time, if I might. I'm curious about the Nancy Reagan-Raisha Gorbachev relationship. Was it actually as amicable as it appeared, or is it true they really didn't care for each other?
No, it's true they didn't care for each other. I'm actually surprised at the idea that it appeared amicable, because they had a hard time concealing the extent to which they disliked each other. And I found in talking to Nancy Reagan for this book that she kept coming back to two people she really, really disliked. And she wanted to, one of these things, when someone you're interviewing raises an issue and keeps coming back to it, one was Donald Regan, who was the White House Chief of Staff. She finally succeeded in getting rid of, who had kept brushing her off and wouldn't take her phone calls. And the other was Raisa Gorbachev. And it was clear that they really didn't like each other, that this wasn't, this wasn't just some little press thing. I mean, it was personal. And to me, one of the triggering event, I think, they have one summit in 1985. It's in Geneva on neutral ground. And it's, it's the way you would think a first summit would proceed. And then they don't meet for a year. And the second summit wasn't really supposed to be a summit. They've had a year without meeting, and there's a series of disagreements on other issues, and Gorbachev says, let's meet for one day to talk about where the next summit is going to be, because the idea had been the next summit would no longer be on neutral ground, but it would be in Washington or Moscow. So let's just get together for 24 hours. Well, that turned out to be the Reykjavik summit, and it was the one, Gorbachev comes in with these long proposals. It turned out to be much more substantive than any other summit, but it wasn't supposed to be a summit. And as part of the diplomacy for that, Nancy Reagan doesn't go, and she thinks that Raisa Gorbachev is not going to go, but she goes. So I think that a year later they meet again in Washington, and Raisa Gorbachev comes in with a grand schedule, and this is Nancy's home turf. So there was genuine dislike.
We have time for just 2 more questions. We'll go to Larry first, and then we'll go to you. It's coming.
Mr. Mann, Rudolf Hess died on or about the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Was there a direct connection between Hess's questionable death and the end of the Cold War?
The short answer is I don't know. What would, I'm not sure why would there be a connection? Right, he was, right. Right.
Hess dies, the wall comes down, and 1 and 1 makes 2. The newspaper made a great deal about Hess's death, and whether it was accidental or murder or what. But then he's dead. There's no need for Spandau. There's no need for a divided Berlin, maybe.
The only connection I can see between Hess and the fall of the wall is a different one. Hess is in Spandau because he has, at the beginning of World War II, gotten in a plane and flown off on a peace mission to Britain. In 1987, a West German kid, 18, 19-year-old, gets in a plane, his own plane, and flies off from West Germany, from West Berlin rather, to Moscow, flies all the way through all the air defenses and lands in Red Square. Amazing incident. And Gorbachev can't figure out why no one in the Soviet military has tried to stop him, shoot him down. He's getting all these non-answers from his own military people. And he decides to shake up the Soviet military, and he fires and moves around just about all of the top Soviet leadership. And that strengthens his own hand to be able to deal with the West. But specifically for Hess in Spandau prison, no.
Here we go.
Mr. Mann, thank you for coming. I've read your book, and I appreciate your straightforward history and everything. And I guess as an ending for the evening, can the current administration and the current climate we're in with our current enemies of America, what is the primary lesson that we can take from Ronald Reagan, his personality, his decisions, his diplomacy? What can we take from that and further this nation's standing in the foreign world today?
I would say the lesson is to be willing to both be strong in security, but also negotiate at the same time. Not be afraid to negotiate at the right time, and to recognize that sometimes leaders overseas who are reformists, who are seeking to change things, are actually important. So this, I mean, you would ask the obvious question, what about Iran? And, you know, Ahmadinejad would be the exact opposite of Gorbachev. An anti-reformer, if there ever was one. But I would say the United States has to continue to be willing to explore diplomacy and to think about what will open up a country. What can the United States do without, you know, going in and insisting we won't talk to you until you're democratic? But short of that, what can the United States do to encourage democratic forces in a country, because it can make a difference for foreign policy as well.